So there's this word in the language you're learning. You've read it in a book and you really want to memorize it. No, you have to memorize it. You've decided you're going to memorize this word if it's the last thing you do. How do you make sure that it does stick in your brain? Well, you may not know that there is a wonderful world of memory techniques out there, and I've invited my friend and memory expert Anthony Metivier onto the channel to explain to you how you can use these memory techniques to remember those all-important words from what you read.
When it comes to Ollie's short story books for language learners, he's hit on something big that gels with the science of memory perfectly. As Ollie points out, reading is a natural SRS. Keep reading and you'll learn lots of vocabulary. I'll frame how this has worked for me with some examples, and they're important to help us dig a bit deeper for a simple reason. Ollie's right, and I've experienced what he's talking about myself. In fact, it wasn't until I added heaps of reading in German, for example, that I started to break through certain plateaus. And I would say this breakthrough effect happens for reasons that go quite beyond SRS, or better said, SRR, spaced repetition reading. It also has to do with absorbing deep cultural meanings, shared references, and certain turns of phrase that simply don't show up anywhere else. Although my reading level in Mandarin still pales in comparison, I'm having the exact same experience with SRR, or what I really think we do need to start calling spaced repetition reading. You naturally start to develop pattern recognition, and it really can take on a kind of autopilot effect, provided you just keep reading. But there is a catch. For one thing, what happens if you want to memorize specific words and focus more on deliberate learning? Or, as happens to just about everyone when they start learning a new language, what if you simply don't have a vocabulary large enough to get started with any meaningful reading at all? That was a problem I wanted to solve when I first started learning German, and faced again when I wanted to start reading in Mandarin. The problem is pretty easy to solve to get yourself a base level of vocabulary quickly if you're willing to learn an ancient memory technique. Although the technique I'm about to share with you will never appeal to everyone, I never would have gotten to reading level without a much more robust memorization approach than any amount of time spent with spaced repetition software. Plus, there is so much scientific research into the technique you're about to learn that hardly a day goes by that people don't ask me, why isn't it taught in schools? Now that's a topic for another day, but the long and short of it is that we no longer have to rely on schools to do their job. We can teach each other. So grab your favorite short stories books from Ollie's collection and let's get started with an overview of what this technique is, why it works, and how you can get started. Here are the 5 steps of the process. First, master the memory palace technique. Second, create and use magnetic associations. 3, rack and stack both sound and meaning into those associations. 4, add phrases wherever possible. And 5, use recall rehearsal to speed up the retention process. Although you might not learn this technique overnight, the reality is that many people do learn the basics within a weekend. And I have many stories from students who have taken this seriously and within very short periods of time memorized substantial amounts of vocabulary. Eldon Clem, for example, memorized 1,000 words in ancient Ethiopic in just 6 weeks. Amanda Markham memorized 200 words in Ranta in 10 days, and perhaps my favorite of all, given the complexity of the alphabet, is Jay Candeloro adding 96 Thai words to his vocabulary in 5 weeks. As he put it in his own words, "Now I'm so confident in remembering any word I've learnt because I have put the word or phrase somewhere in my memory palace instead of not having a place to search for it. After reviewing my memory palaces a couple of times, I feel so confident in never forgetting a single word. I've only been doing this for about 5 weeks and I've already learned 96 Thai words, which seemed impossible before I started." I know it can seem impossible, especially if you're rusty and not used to using your mind in the ways I'm about to suggest. But think of it this way. NASA got people to the moon. All we're talking about is using rooms in buildings you already know, people, and pop culture references you already know, and combining them in memorable ways. It's far from rocket science, and anyone can do it. So as Ollie suggests, read every chapter straight through, regardless of whether you understand it or not. This will help you start the basis for pattern recognition. It's kind of like a farmer prepares the field by first defining the space and then walking it step by step to learn the ins and outs of the land. The farmer cannot predict the season or exactly how the plants are going to look before the harvest, but the farmer walks the field anyway, simply observing the process. At the end of each chapter, there's a vocabulary list. This is where you're going to use a memory palace, because when you commit even just a few of those words to memory using this technique, the next time you read the chapter, not only will your pattern recognition be much stronger, you'll be able to play a mental game that helps you determine the meaning. A while back, it was looking like I might be going to Italy, so I grabbed a copy of short stories in Italian. At the end of chapter 1, there's a list of vocabulary. The first word is zaino, which means backpack. Now, I have oodles of memory palaces that come to mind, so I picked the one where my boss was named Zoltan. It's hard to believe now, but during my second year of university, I worked both semesters as the night janitor in a movie theater under his watch. Now, movie theaters make for great memory palaces, so it was in one corner of this memory palace that I placed this new word and its meaning. Maybe you won't have such an association, but there's a reason I do this in my personal practice. For one thing, the Z to Z correspondence is very strong. It's so much easier to select a location that will automatically trigger what you're looking for when there's a relationship you can draw upon. I could have easily used the Canadian department store Zellers, Zara's where my wife sometimes likes to shop, or the temple where I sometimes sit and practice something like Zen. I'm sure if you put a little thought into it, you can find these associations yourself. Now, if this had been a new memory palace for me, I would have taken a few seconds to draw it out. I recommend you do that with yours as well. Don't overthink this step. I'm talking about simple squares on paper, not professional blueprinting. Here's one of my own drawings to show you what I mean. Now, it might not be instantly clear how to pronounce a word like zaino, so you can hop on over to a site like forvo.com.
Zaino. Zaino. Zaino.
And the next step is to think of how you're going to remember the sound and meaning. Here's where having a predetermined list of associations really comes in handy, something you'll develop over time and can also generate in just an hour or two if you set aside some time for it. Basically, you want to go through every letter of the alphabet and give each letter an object, a person, and an action. For zaino, the first thing that came to mind was nothing with a Z sound, but instead both my friend Simon and Cy Sperling, founder of Hair Club for Men, who, as he often said, was also a client.
I'm Cy Sperling, president of Hair Club for Men. And remember, I'm not only the Hair Club president, but I'm also a client.
Me? Apparently not. I also thought about no theater, and when combined, Cy, Simon, and no theater make the basic sound zaino. The next step is just a matter of combining them together with a backpack, which is what this word means. I simply imagined Simon trying to steal Cy's backpack, which was filled with no masks and costumes for the theater, all of which were covered in hair. That's an additional touch to help me remember that it's Cy, and I need that sound associated to kick off the memory of zaino as being the Italian word for backpack. Now, at this point, a lot of people are going to object that all of this is too much work and that it would take them forever to start thinking like this, assuming they could ever get their existing brains to come up with obscure infomercial figures like Cy Sperling. I get it, and was once there myself. I started using these techniques during a dark depression that almost succeeded in talking me out of getting started. But I persisted, and not only did I start getting reasonably fast, but I discovered many ways to speed up the process. The practice also started making me feel less depressed, something I remained amazed by, and all the more so when I found the research of Dr. Tim Dalglish and his team. They've been showing for several years how working with the Memory Palace technique helps relieve people of their symptoms from PTSD, depression, and other issues. I'll spare you the scientific reasons behind how and why this works, but it boils down to positive doses of dopamine, and because new learning is involved, the power of those doses can lead to incredible gains that last, especially as new habits in thinking and behavior form. I'm so passionate about teaching these techniques nearly 2 decades later, not merely because they help me learn languages faster, but precisely because they saved my life. So how on earth does something that takes this long to explain, thank you for your patience, ever scale to the point that you could add 1,000 words to your vocabulary in 6 weeks? Good question. All you have to do is add the next word and the next word and the next to your memory palace and follow the steps. If you're working with a list from all these books, you might not memorize them all immediately or ever. But if you pick just a percentage of them, make these associations, add a few phrases to each, and then follow the repetition patterns, you'll be golden and understand so much more as you continue reading. To perform these patterns, first memorize 5 to 10 words. Next, find yourself a quiet place and go through the magnetic imagery you encoded into your memory palace. Start at the first magnetic station in any of your memory palaces and keep going until you come to the end of the journey. For example, if your memory palace has 10 stations, start at magnetic station 1 and then decode the magnetic imagery you created there. Once done and you're satisfied that you've decoded the information correctly, move to the second magnetic station. Repeat this process until you've reached the 10th magnetic station in the memory palace. Following these steps can hack the serial positioning effect and give each piece of information you've encoded equal amounts of primacy and recency. So, travel your memory palace journeys forward, travel your memory palace journeys backward, travel your memory palace journeys from the center to the beginning and from the center to the end, and then travel the magnetic stations of your memory palace by leapfrogging or skipping over even and odd stations, both forward and backwards. And then pop into random magnetic stations once in a while. For example, magnetic station 7 at one time, and then later to magnetic station 2. How long do you have to follow these patterns? There's no cookie cutter answer, but one way of looking at it is obvious. If you keep reading and continue to use the memory palace technique, Ollie will be even more right that reading is a natural SRS. And as far as I can tell, humans come from nature. Humans invented the memory techniques you've just learned thousands of years ago. So if you're going to do SRR or spaced repetition reading, I cannot think of anything more natural than to do some of that reading using one or more memory palaces that you can access anytime from within the comfort of your own head. Now, speaking of reading for language learning, one of the great masters of memory applied something called ars combinatoria, or the art of combination, for carrying not only entire books in his head when he couldn't carry them on his back, he also did some language learning too. So if you want to learn more about how he used memory techniques to learn languages, head on over to my channel and check out 3 ways to use the memory palace technique for language learning next.